Hello, this is Mad Cat, and welcome to another impromptu show. I have to thank Miss Natty from the Liberty Bells for today's show. I'm trying to load up the YouTube thing. Hold up a second. Wanna pay attention to comments as I receive them, although I doubt I'll get very many being this early in the morning. Come on, there we go. Also does a nice... All right, so the case for trigger warnings, and the actual title is much more lengthy, but I'm going to go over a analysis of the research paper, if you can call it that, and we're going to explore this together to understand why do we need trigger warnings in the classroom, specifically in colleges, although if it were widely recognized for colleges, it would only be a matter of time before it was implemented in high school, junior high, and elementary schools. Can you imagine a 5-year-old saying, "Trigger warning, using scissors triggers me"? I'm looking forward to that day. Actually, I'm not looking forward to that day, but I'll laugh when that day comes. So let me go ahead and start off showing you. Let's see. The initial article that was given to me. Now, this is there any evidence that trigger warnings work? And this is by Harry Chu, not Arthur Chu. I kept thinking it was Arthur Chu, but it's actually Harry Chu. And Harry Chu, he attempts to write an article which is just a basically him saying, "Hey, I wrote an article one time about this. Everyone pay attention to me." So I'm going to just read this paragraph here. My exploration of this topic led me to compile my findings into a 51-page report titled "Trigger Warnings and the Need for Evidence-Based Intervention on University Campuses." And that's the paper we're going to look at today. The goal of this report is to move the discussion of trigger warnings forward. I examine rationales offered for their implementation, their current stage of usage, predicted outcomes on mental health, and I explored unanswered questions and offer a framework for pursuing empirical evidence of their supposed efficacy. Their report notes the lack of empirical evidence presently supporting the efficacy of trigger warnings, but most worrying is the apparent lack of interest in obtaining the evidence. So yeah, we're not going to read this whole article here. I just wanted to read that because that was a good introduction into this. This is actually the article itself. And we're not going to read from here because if you look, it's just walls of text. I mean, it is fucking ridiculous just how much information he stuffs into paragraphs. And if this is a standard for research papers that you have to have just these long ass paragraphs, and I know they don't look too long here, but when you put it in Microsoft Word, like this paragraph here takes up an entire page. And the further you go into it, it's just the longer and longer it is. It's just so fucking ridiculous. So I converted it to Word and then I broke up the paragraphs so it's easier to view. So let me go ahead and get that started. Now, I didn't change anything from what Harry Chu did. So all of the grammar mistakes are still in there, Mr. Harry. Don't worry, I make grammar mistakes too. I'm not going to criticize you for that. But I mean, maybe you might want to have someone go in there and proofread it like me or something. You can pay me for it. I'll charge a lot of money, though. So here's the paper. Go ahead and close that, and we'll go ahead and minimize the ribbon. All right, so here is the research paper. It's a 51 pages, but it ended up being about 68 with all the formatting changes I made. Oh, Statochrist! You know, he's always saying that he wants to be on when I start a video, and here he is with a here from the beginning. Congrats, man. All right, so you're going to notice that I've also highlighted the paragraphs. This is actually for my sake. I use a 5-colored system when I highlight. I know, highly complex, but it works for me. Just for sake of reference, orange usually is the most important ideas. Green is supporting ideas. Pink or magenta, dark magenta, is just supporting ideas of the supporting ideas, minor details. Blue and then yellow, and those tend to be useless information. Sometimes I use purple as an indication of this is the most important idea, and red as you fucking moron. And yes, I do use the red color a couple of times throughout this. So, all right, so we're going to try to go through this as quick as possible. For better or worse, the debate over trigger warnings across university campuses have changed the perception of public universities. This change in perception is important because the general public funds these universities through their tax dollars, and there's genuine concern that universities are not fulfilling their purpose of graduating mature adults who are capable of thinking critically, entering the workforce, and contributing positively to society. It's called an Oxford comma. Look into it. Sorry, it's just one of my pet peeves. So that is 100% correct. I 100% agree with that, that I am concerned. Yeah, I'm concerned that we're not producing adults who... Sorry, my email. Yes, we get it. I have email. Okay. We're not producing mature adults who are capable of critical thinking. So Sadochrist says, I was just about to go to bed, but I see that you're alive, so I'm staying up. All right. So feel free to comment about any of this bullshit here, because, again, this is more of a propaganda piece than anything else. And remember, a lot of this was just like one giant paragraph, so I did break them up. So that's going to look a little bit different if you decide to go and read the original paper yourself. Now, pertaining to these goals, ensuring positive mental health outcomes for students is an issue that has been in the spotlight, but a disconnect between the situation on university campuses and public perception exists when it comes to mental health and the use of trigger warnings. This is in part because the current state of trigger warnings on university campuses has become an enigma for those on the outside looking in. It is evident from public perspective that articles informing the trigger warning debate have brought to view the polarized ends of rationale supporting or opposing the use of trigger warnings in university classrooms. So that is a good elongated introduction to what this paper is about. And I do have to give it to Harry Chu. He does show both sides of the argument. He does so poorly and then proceeds to ignore what the opposition has to say, but he does at least present it. Now, I want you to pay attention to all of this pink. I think I used dark magenta a little bit later, but I want you to pay attention to this because you're going to start noticing a pattern. Okay, for example, Gina Baraka, an English professor at the University of Connecticut, asserted that trigger warnings encourage you to interrupt or suppress responses before you encounter any representation, action, idea, or emotion you suspect might make you uncomfortable, undermining the purpose of authentic education, which requires evocation and disturbance of one's emotional and intellectual facilities. She went on to insert that she would quit her teaching position if warnings were ever mandated, echoing the hard stance that many instructors have taken on not using trigger warnings in their courses. Now, you see what Chu is doing here is that he's presenting her idea and then demonizing her, but he's doing it in a very stealthy way. He's like, well, this is an example of those who are just opposed to it. And rather than say, well, she makes, somewhat of a valid point here, and this is a concern that we have with trigger warnings, he's finding a way to demonize her for saying, well, this is a representation. They'd rather quit than try to actually help students. Advocates of trigger warnings, such as George S. Bridge, president of Evergreen State College, suggested the University of Chicago's rejection of trigger warning was either completely tone deaf to the academics and developmental needs of many students, or is launching its own counterattack on what it perceives as unwanted assault on political correctness on campus, or both. Bridges contends that trigger warnings are a way for universities to address historically ignored issues such as sexual violence and is a valuable tool for promoting personal and academic success. So, because Bridge supports trigger warnings, now he's giving him a positive attribute. He gave Gina, English professor, something negative. He's given George Bridge something positive. So he's trying to affect the reader as they read this, and this is more of a subconscious manipulation here. But he's trying to say, Gina bad, George good. So the paper hopes to put together the pieces towards a more complete picture through exploration of the controversial issue of trigger warnings and its potential implications on mental health. Rationales for and against the implementation of trigger warnings on university campuses are summarized along with the desired outcome for trigger warnings in classroom settings. The goal of the paper is to move the discussion of trigger warnings forward from rationales for their implementation, their current state, and predictions of their effects on students' mental health outcomes, to exploring unanswered questions and offer a framework for pursuing empirical evidence for their supported efficacy. I have problems with that word, efficacy. In addition, this paper provides recommendations for existing evidence-based interventions that universities should consider when it comes to equipping students with the coping skills to handle psychological stress. Now, if only it actually did any of that. Okay, so why trigger warnings? The rationale for implementing trigger warnings is clear, as Goddard and Root, who I will now refer to as Groot, I am Groot, asserts that it's not about civility, it's about compassion. The goal is to respect a student's right not to be surprised by content that may cause distress. The right is inherent in what Groot calls consent. Consent, which provides survivors of childhood abuse, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, colonialism, institutionalized police violence, racism, homophobia, transphobia, genocide, and war. I'm sorry, if you've experienced genocide, you wouldn't technically be alive because all of your people would be dead. Only way you genuinely experience genocide if it's an attempted genocide, or you were on the other side who is trying to genocide someone else. Just a point of contention here. It feels like he's just trying to throw the word genocide in there because it's a powerful word. It's almost like Groot is trying to trigger us as we read their paper. Just the thought. And war, with the power to make decisions in their lives and to take ownership of their participation in the classroom. So basically, anyone who refuses to do it is trying to control a student into participating in their classroom and doesn't respect the fact that certain topics might be too much for them to handle. LaGuardia states that trigger warnings allow students to make necessary preparation for potentially distressing material, thus enabling them to participate in all content rather than being accidentally, biologically, and uncontrollably removed from class activities. Now, see, the problem I have with this is when Christina Hoff Sommers spoke at some university, there were girls who attended there who claimed that they needed a safe space. In fact, a safe space was set up ahead of time with coloring books and bubbles and puppies. So anyone who had any problem with this could go to a safe space. Now, during her talk, a student claimed that her dog was triggered by what Christina Hoff Sommers said. Now, this is a great insult to anyone who has triggers. And even if we wanted to consider for the possibility that what these people are going through in the classroom are actual psychological triggers, saying a dog had a trigger warning should be a great insult to everyone across the board. And yet feminists defended this, saying, well, her dog was triggered. That's how bad Christina Hoff Sommers is. Ha 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 ha. No. And that's why I don't take this too seriously. And I'll discuss this as we go further into it, but you know, and Harry here doesn't really do a good job of convincing me that they're necessary, and I'll demonstrate how he failed to do that. Santa Chris, I think guys should just say all the things women hate men doing as sexual abuse. So when women come up and just touch you for no reason, that would be sexual abuse to women. Men should say the same thing about women's behavior. You know, I think there's a case there because I remember being in the BDSM community. I mean, they really stress the rule that you don't touch someone unless you're invited to do so. And that's a fair rule. But I'd have women come up all the time, not all the time, often enough, would just touch me. Now, they wouldn't touch me in, like, say, my penis or anything like that, but they'd touch my stomach or what have you. Places that if I did it to a woman would be offended. And women will just come up and do this. And, you know, I think that if women are going to cry rape on even just looking at them, maybe men should play them at their own game and say that anytime a woman just touches them, it's sexual assault. Give them a taste for their own medicines. Not a bad idea. Santa Chris, I have legit PTSD and it pisses me off when these women say they have it from Twitter. Yeah. You know, I don't deny trigger warnings exist. I think there are such thing as trigger warnings. And I do acknowledge the levels of trauma out there, that you can have a mild trigger from a mild traumatic event. However, what we rationalize as trauma is different between these social justice warriors and all of us in the real world. Just being on Twitter and receiving a negative remark, I mean, sure, I've had it done to me, but it doesn't cause me to be like, oh, I can't go to work now because someone said something mean to me on Twitter. Well, why don't you block them? I shouldn't have to block them. Everyone should know to treat me nice, even if I call them a piece of shit. Say it, to Chris. Random women on the street would just come up to me and touch my stomach. So, yeah. I mean, as men, we're not really bothered by this, but what bothers us is the double standard that women are free to do whatever they want and men are not. And I'm not saying that, it's necessarily okay for um, people to randomly touch each other, but if women are so harping on even having a compliment given their way as sexual assault, looking at them as sexual assault, touching them on the shoulder. I was at the Ren Fair this past weekend, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I met a woman there. She was a singer, and I gave her a $1 tip, and we spoke for a little bit. And, I reached out for her hand, but I stopped in midair, basically inviting her for her hand to go in there. And I was holding it like I was going to go for a kiss. I was too scared to give her a kiss. Not because, I lack the social ability to be able to kiss a girl on the hand, but I was worried that I would wind up on the 10 o'clock news that, oh, this guy thought it was okay to kiss me on the hand. He's a misogynist. We live in a rape culture. That's the effect that this has caused. Now, I think she was expecting me to do it because she was playing the part of being in the Ren Fair and, all of that. And I wanted to. I really did. But I'm like, I don't think I should. And maybe I could have asked her for permission, but, it was better just the way I left it. But that's the double standard we live in. Women can come up randomly and touch me, but I'm too scared at a Ren Fair to hold a woman's hand and kiss her on the hand, which are probably a lot of people do. Seto Chris. No, I wasn't bothered by it, but yeah, it is the double standard. Personally, I don't care about physical contact with other people, and I really don't. I'm a touchy-feely type. I love to touch other people. I love other people touching me. But at the same time, social justice warriors have pushed the line over so far, it's like hard to know whether or not I'm going to be accused of being a rapist for a simple gesture. All right, let's continue on. So, LaGuardia states that trigger warnings allow students. Oh, yeah, I read it. Carter claims that trigger warnings are not about safety, but about access. Access which allows us traumatized individuals to enter the conversation, just like automatic doors allow people who use wheelchairs to easily enter a building. Carter suggests that when trigger warnings are viewed as tools for access, they do not provide a way to opt out of anything, nor do they offer protection from the realities of the world, but rather empower students to opt in by dampening the shock of potentially distressing materials and giving autonomy to traumatized individuals to deal with their trauma. Now, Harry Chu will actually demonstrate that this is not true and then just ignore it. Now, here's the positive thing that I will say about Harry. He does show what the opposition to trigger warnings thinks. Those who speak against the use of trigger warnings, including Lakhanoff and Haidt, hated, I don't know how to say that, contend that using trigger warnings as a way to avoid trauma reactivation from potentially distressing materials may do more harm than good for students in the long run. Lakhanoff suggests that the classroom is a safe place for students to be exposed to incidental reminders of trauma and to renegotiate association with those reminders because a discussion of violence is unlikely to be followed by actual violence. And this is good right here. And I agree with this that, they say to people that do have PTSD, people who do have traumatic events in their lives and that they're triggered by things, that you can't just avoid it. You have to deal with it. You have to learn how to deal with it. And being in a classroom, okay, it's the possibility that if someone hears about rape and they themselves have been raped, might be triggered by that. But at the same time, if when they're exposed to that, it's an opportunity for them to learn how to cope with this, about hearing about it, understanding that they're not going to be raped afterwards. So it's a good opportunity as a coping mechanism if there ever was any. Sato Chris, it was really bad when I was about 16. Older women about 28 to 30 would constantly try to hit on me. So here's some support of the negative side. In 2014, the American Association of University Professors published a report on trigger warnings, citing concern that if, again, I'm not criticizing for grammar, but Harry, have someone read through this again. If controversial topics such as sex, race, class, capitalism, and colonialism are associated with trigger warnings, faculties might choose to avoid potentially triggering topics for fear of offending students or having complaints leveled against them. And that would be bad right there. We completely remove anything that might trigger someone so as not to ruin their jobs. In 2015, the University of Chicago took a clear-cut stance on academic freedom by asserting that it's not the proper role of the university to attempt to shield individuals from ideas and opinions they find unwelcoming, disagreeable, or even deeply offensive. And in a letter to informing freshmen in 2016, reiterated that our commitment to academic freedom means that we do not support so-called trigger warnings. Anyone who's going to college, go to University of Chicago. They need your money. All right, so now Stallman suggests that the concept of trigger warnings assumes that students are incapable of anticipating potentially distressing content based on the nature of the course, and they possess inadequate coping skills to deal with the distressing course content. Bingo! Right there. Should have been a pink magenta. But that right there is the most important thing. By saying that we need trigger warnings indicates that these students are infants, that they can't figure out for themselves that there might be distressing content, and that they don't have any coping skills whatsoever, or that they can't learn coping skills on their own. Okay, so here's an important point that really demonstrates a lot of what this paper is about. The biological symptoms of trauma in PTSD diagnosis are rarely disputed, but there are contrasting perspectives on the definition of trauma. The American Psychiatric Association Diagnosis and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, DSM-5, So if you see DSM-5, that's what it's referring to. Defines trauma in as exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, or learning of such trauma from close friends or family members, as cited in Boysen. So, yeah, I can agree with that thing there that, if you experience a life or death situation, if you have serious injury or sexual violence, such as rape, you could develop PTSD. You could develop PTSD. It's also possible you could develop PTSD by association, that if someone close to you goes through these things, like if you have a family member that dies, you could develop PTSD, depending on the nature of their deaths and the closeness of your relationship. I would argue that it would be a mild form of it, but it could turn into PTSD if it's not properly treated. And it's possible if someone really, really close to you suffered through rape, it might be possible to develop PTSD, but that one is a little bit more difficult for me to accept. But it might be possible. And I know a lot of feminists will try to, well, I had a friend that was raped and I couldn't function after that. Why? You weren't the one who was raped. And was it even really a close friend? I mean, would your close friend want you talking about their rape to the world? Just a thought. It has been noted that under the DSM-5 definition, non-occupational exposure to related deaths or traumatic events through electronic media, television, movies, pictures, or through literature that depicts violence would not qualify as events that could cause trauma. Now, I do have Sado Chris is going to shut up now because he says whatever I say, whatever he writes. No, please keep doing it because I think it really adds to the conversation. In all honesty, if you have an opinion, throw it up. I love reading what my audience thinks. That's how it separates me from all the other people. So please, Sado Chris, if you have something pertinent to say to this, or you want to discuss some sort of bullshit, double standards, or traumas you've suffered, please post it, because this is what this is all about. And you're demonstrating a double standard, which I think goes along perfectly with this, but all the other things as well. So here we have Chu is setting a goal, a definition. Here's the goalpost. This is what it's defined as. Now he's going to attempt to move it. Give me one moment. I need a soda. The concerns were raised following a now retracted draft. Actually, I'm going to skip that because you can read it yourself, but Arthur conceptualized trauma outside the bounds of the medical model of disability and refers to trauma as embodied affective structure. Embodied affective structure that regulates an individual or population outside of the homogenic notions of normative subjectivity. From this perspective, trauma no longer resides in the minds and bodies of individuals, but in the built environments and social patterns that exclude or stigmatize popular kinds of bodies, minds, and ways of being. So basically, if if someone in elementary school calls you a poopy head, that is trauma. I know, I'm oversimplifying it. I mean, if you're subject to racism, then you could suffer a trauma. Well, it comes to question, how deep does that racism go? If we're talking about the United States, then no. You're just using it as an excuse to try to get out of whatever you're doing, because racism is not really a thing in the United States. Actually, most first world countries, it's not a thing. So, but I mean, if we're talking, even if someone says something bad to you, that doesn't then facilitate it as being trauma. Now, if you are attacked, like a bunch of white guys go, "Hey, boy, get on over here," and proceeds to beat up a black guy, then yeah, I could see that as trauma, because that's physical violence. And he might have even believed that he could have died. So this here is just moving the goalposts of saying, well, if it doesn't have to be in their minds, it can just be a societal norm that someone experiences. That could be trauma. Santa Chris says it well. If someone in the second grade calls you a poopy head, that's homogenic masculinity and toxic. As we move forward with the discussion of trigger warnings, it's important to take note of different definitions of trauma to put forth, and that the contentions that revolve around them. For the purpose of this paper, any recommendation put forth refers to the DSM-5 definition of trauma and accompanying psychological distress when the word trauma is referenced. Now, this is interesting, is that even though he puts in there that trauma can just basically be anything you want, he says, but we're only going to refer to what the DSM-5 refers to as trauma. Okay, so it should also be noted that this paper makes an effort not to loosely interchange the terms trauma and PTSD, as one is clinically defined. It is a clinically defined condition, while the other describes one or many events that can lead to PTSD, depending on the threshold of psychological distress. Okay, that I can agree with. The constituents that define trauma can also vary dramatically, as noted above. The prevalence of individuals who have experienced exposure to traumatic events and individuals who suffer from PTSD are also vastly different, as shown later on. That I can agree. Not all trauma leads to PTSD. Those who suffer a traumatic event don't necessarily get PTSD. Even if you wanted to argue with me that the woman who claimed she got PTSD on Twitter suffered a traumatic event on Twitter, I wouldn't classify her as suffering PTSD. I mean, she truly suffered PTSD, she would have just left Twitter altogether. And even then, I would have my questions. All right. So here's a very important part about this paper. I'm not trying to read this whole thing, but this part I'm going to really go into. The current state of trigger warnings in universities. Since the migration of trigger warnings from the virtual realm into the university classroom, the general public has relied on individual articles on reported incidents and anecdotes from professors and students to inform themselves on a state of trigger warnings on university campuses. While snapshots are useful for creating general impressions of how instructors use trigger warnings, several surveys have emerged to inform us on the attitudes of instructors who are in position to issue such warning and the prevalence of their usage. Now, the one thing that I'm going to say now, which is going to be pertinent as we get deeper into this, is that he denotes that this started online and eventually moved into the university classrooms. But the one thing he doesn't explore is why. Why now? Why in the last 3 years has this become prevalent? It's not like rape just suddenly got invented within the last 3 years. Rape, death, murder, war, genocide, these things have existed since pretty much the beginning of time. It's existed for 9,000 years. So why now are trigger warnings prevalent? And maybe what we need to be doing is studying the cause of the sudden surge of it, rather than saying, well, it now exists. We need to figure out what to do about it. Because you're only attacking a symptom of the problem. And as someone who's gone to many doctors who don't treat my condition seriously and instead try to focus on one symptom and say, well, if we solve this one symptom, we solve everything. That doesn't help at all. And that's what this paper is trying to do, is saying, hey, this has now become a thing. We must now find ways to deal with it, and everyone has to change in accordance, even though it's happened within the last 3 years. This paper does not once introduce the idea of how students were different 10 years ago and today. And I would argue that culture hasn't changed that much in the last 10 years. Not that much if you really look at it. These whiny bitches who are crying about trigger warnings and all of that, they existed back then. It's just now they have more of a voice. But we need to be exploring the underlying cause of all of this. Now, maybe there's something to these trigger warnings. I'm willing to go there and say, well, maybe there's something going on. And maybe we need to have them. Maybe. But really have a discussion about this. Why now? Why not 10 years ago? Why not during 9/11? 9/11 was one of the hardest years for people. Why wasn't there trigger warnings back then? Why not during World War II, Vietnam, Korea? Why now? In a time that's relatively peaceful. Alceda Chris says, trigger warnings are more prevalent now because more women are in universities now. I disagree with that, Seda Chris. More women have been in universities since the 80s. Women have outnumbered men since the 1980s. Now, it was like a very small percentage-wise, but since that time, and even in the 90s, it became a lot more prevalent that more women were in universities than men. And the 2000s, and now the 2010s. We're just exiting the 2010s. So what? That's 30 years that women have outnumbered men. So that doesn't really answer the question. He says it's possible that women are actually really conservative. They seem to want to go back to the 1800s lifestyle. I agree with that to a point. They want to go back to the 1800s lifestyle of an upper class woman, because lower class, they had to go out and work. I mean, back during that time, women and children worked in factories just along with the men. Now, yes, admittedly, men made more money than them, but still. But they want to go back to a time where women were not responsible for themselves at all and enjoyed all the benefits of society, which was the upper echelon. Also, they did help with the sexual revolution back in the 60s. It's reasonable to conclude that this has been building since that time, since pretty much the first wave of feminism. It eventually would have gotten to this point. Although I'm sure that first wave and second waves probably didn't want it to go this far, as evident by Christina Hoff Sommers. Though one could argue that maybe her problem is that the feminists are against her. If the feminists supported her despite their own viewpoints, maybe she'd be singing a different tune. I don't know. But Christina Hoff Sommers is a good representation of second wave feminism, and it appears that modern feminism hates second wave feminism. All right, so now this refers to some studies going on, and I want you to pay attention to the parts that I highlighted, or rather unhighlighted. So the National Coalition Against Censorship surveyed 800 members of Modern Language Association and College Art Association. 15% of instructors reported that students had requested warnings in their course, and 12% noted students' complaints to faculty or administrator about the lack of trigger warnings. Now, you could say that that is 27%, but we don't necessarily know if all 12% of those were outside of that initial 15%. There could have been crossover that they felt that there wasn't enough trigger warnings. I haven't looked at the study myself, and it's actually not so easy to look at those studies. Places that'll let you do that want to charge you like $80 just to view one. One of these days, I'd like to have an account to where I can go and look at any study I can, but that costs money. But I will even give it to them that maybe it is a 27%. But at the very least, it's 15% that requested directly from the instructor to have warnings in their classroom. Okay, more recently, an NPR ED survey found that 829 responding undergraduate instructors, 51% used trigger warnings in their classrooms, and 64.7% reporting that they had done so of their own volition because they thought the material needed one. Only 3.4% of instructors reported that students had requested trigger warnings. And 1.8 cited that their university had any official policies on trigger warnings. Now, here's some tricky math that's going on here. Someone could take this and say, well, 64.7% of classrooms of professors state that they include trigger warnings because they feel that it's necessary. Well, that's some tricky math because it's 64.7 of 51%, which I've done the math, and it's about 30% of 829 professors. 30% of all of those professors felt that they needed to include trigger warnings, and they did so of their own volition. So we're getting to that 30% number constantly. Examine the attitudes of professors who regularly teach course with materials on suicide, trauma, and sex. Boysen surveyed 131 abnormal psychology professors and found that 49% of them did not use trigger warnings. 31% did, and 20% were unfamiliar with the term. Of the 80% who were familiar with trigger warnings, 40% were neutral on the issue, 34% believe it would be helpful, and 25% believe they would be harmful. So I'm going to go ahead and skip past this. Taken together, the information these surveys suggest that there is no clear consensus on the use of trigger warnings from administrators and instructors in the position to issue them. Few universities have any formal policies on trigger warnings, meaning instructors are free to implement it as they see fit. Well, the problem is, he's saying, well, there's no clear information on their use. Well, actually, that's not true. There is clear information. At best, we're talking about 30% of people that either request that trigger warnings be given, or 30% of instructors who feel it's necessary to have trigger warnings in their classroom. 30%. Now, 30% is sizable. 30% is 1/3 right there. But it also means that 2/3 either have not had requests made to them or don't implement them in any way, or don't believe that they're necessary to be implemented. Now, the thing is that some of those who don't believe that it needs to be implemented might be forced to do so anyways, but there's some data here. And Mr. Chu is choosing to ignore that data. Instead of saying, well, here's when I put it all together, here's the results that I get. This is an interesting finding. Now, 30% is sizable, and I think we should explore that 30%, and maybe we can come up with some, new truths. Maybe we can find out some information that we didn't previously know. Instead, he says, carte blanche, no clear consensus. This is intellectually dishonest. Say to Chris, I hope you're doing well. It's ages between your posts. Yeah, I know. It's mostly because I don't really have the equipment to do videos like I want. And that's one of the reasons why my Patreon is now dedicated to me getting a computer. So I can actually render video and I can do a lot more for my channel. But it's also because, I'm trying to get my life stabilized so I can maybe in the next 2 years find a way to care for myself. Trying to get into the freelance thing. I'm trying to get my name out there more as a writer. So, so now I'm going to put this out there. He talks about the current state of trigger warnings. Now he's going to say what warrants a trigger warning. And the one thing I'm going to say is that he doesn't actually answer any questions. Look at what he's doing. You saw the first part. Pink, lots of pink on this one. More pink. All he's doing in this report is just saying what other people are saying, but he's not really drawing a conclusion on what any of this crap is. He's just saying, this is what this one side says about it. This is what this side says about it. I'm going to completely ignore that side and say, hey, we need more work in this area. Without giving us, a way of saying, okay, when we look at these two data points, it represents a general unknown area. I mean, maybe this side could be right. Maybe this other side could be right. So let's start. In the virtual realm, trigger warnings are issued for a multiplicity of topics, including but not limited to misogyny, racism, homophobia, PTSD, slavery, victim blaming, self injury, child abuse, discussion of isms, discussions of sex, including consensual, corpses, blood, and anything that might inspire intrusive thoughts in people with OCD. So, basically, it's kind of referring to what the previous person, Carter, said about what constitutes trauma, and it's reaffirming that, even though Chu said that he will refer to the DSM-5 for its definition, has now moved the goalpost of saying, well, Filipovic has said that, trigger warnings in the virtual realm are issued for all of these things. Misogyny, you would have to really, really, really give me a good case where someone being insulted by a man, some woman being insulted by a man, could cause trauma. Same with racism, same with homophobia, especially since, if I say I'm not into gay men, that makes me a homophobe. It doesn't matter if my sexual preference is that I strongly, strongly, strongly prefer women, but and I'm into maybe bisexual women, I'm into straight women, but I'm not into lesbians, that makes me a homophobe. So it's really hard for me to believe that there needs to be a trigger warning for homophobia, since it doesn't really exist. Or if it does exist in very small pockets. Trigger warnings for PTSD. You need trigger warnings for PTSD? I mean, if you have PTSD, you might need trigger warnings, but the discussion of PTSD causes trigger warnings? Slavery? Okay, I'll give you that one. Victim blaming? No. Self-injury? Okay, I'll give you that one. Child abuse? Yeah. Discussion of isms? No. Discussions of sex, including consensual? Well, if you were raped, okay, I could understand how that might trigger you. But if the sex you had was consensual, how does that constitute a trigger? Corpses, blood. Well, here we're talking about people's phobia, and yeah, that could trigger someone if their phobia is enough that it can do that. People can freeze, and that's about the only exception outside of trauma that I would include in that. But none of the other things constitute phobias, except homophobia. But I mean, that's not that you have homophobia, that's that you experience homophobia, and that causes a trigger response. Say to Chris, won't honey badgers have you on their show? Well, the honey badgers tend to only have people that are doing important work and are a little bit on the popular side. And yeah, I'm doing the calendars and all of that, but that's still a little bit of small potatoes, at least for right now. If you would like me to appear on the honey badgers, the best thing you can do is email the honey badgers and say, hey, we'd like to see Mad Cat on a show. And they do pay attention to that. And if they get enough requests for that, then they'll likely reach out to me and say, hey, some people have been asking about you being on. Would you be interested in coming on for a show? So it's just if there's interest in me, because they're trying to build the best possible show they can every week. So, and it's just the way it works for the honey badgers. TJWK2. Wow, that's a mouthful. Yellow oh ha. Yellow ha 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 ho ha ho ha. However you say that. All right. Moving on. Below are reported examples for subject areas, specific materials which trigger warnings have been issued or requested in university classrooms. These subject areas should be of interest to the general public, students, and instructors alike because, in contrast to online warnings, warnings in the classrooms are related to learning materials within the student's discipline and have an impact on subsequent career outcomes. So let's read through some of these pink parts because it tells us about what's actually happening out there. Oxford University Law Facility issued trigger warnings about potentially distressing content before lectures on sexual offenses, which gave students the opportunity to excuse themselves if they saw fit. Excuse themselves from lectures. Last time I checked, every lecture you go to tends to be important. And missing a lecture means that you don't get that information that may later be on a test. And if there's an instruction that's given that's like, oh, it's not really important, then it wouldn't be a mandated one. A trigger warning wouldn't be necessary for that because people can just show up if they want to or not. International law class Patrick Keenan at the University of Illinois issued verbal warnings about the horrific details of sexual violence during war and noted, I wouldn't invite someone to my house and say we're going to watch Finding Nemo and then show them a snuff film. Yeah, but it's like maybe you wouldn't invite someone to your house. Well, you invite someone to your house and they say, hey, what movie they're going to see? And you say, it's a surprise. And then you show them a snuff film. That I can understand being problematic. But it's not like you don't tell your students, hey, by the way, we're going to watch this documentary. And a student doesn't take it upon themselves and look it up. Like, oh, I'm going to have problems with this film. That requires students to be responsible for themselves. No. Let's put it all on the professor to take extra pains to coddle students so they don't think for themselves. These warnings follow a 2014 article by Ginny Suck. So does Ginny suck? A Harvard law professor who observed an increasing apprehension of students towards rape law and noted that individual students often ask teachers not to include the law of rape on exams due to the concerns that these sensitive topics would decrease performance. So the concern that if someone has to read about rape on a test, it might trigger them and they do more poorly on tests. Now, I do know from this article that was written, or at least the news during that time, that anyone who's going into law, whether they want to do any sort of law whatsoever, whether it's criminal law, whether it's sexual assault, whether it's I meant sexual harassment, but or even maritime law, they still have to take a class that discusses rape law. They kind of have to take a general law class. And that's where some of the concern is that in these general law classes, rape is discussed. Suck recalls that in one case, a professor received a request to stop using the word violate during the lecture because the student felt it was triggering. I do remember that as well. You can't use the word violate. Well, to me, that sounds like trying to censor someone. Oh, you can't use the word violate because it's triggering. Also, you can't use the term B, C, D, or F because those are triggering. So just give me an A so you don't trigger me. That's what it's coming down to. And I once said that my gender is 4.0. And if you and my gender pronouns are 4.0. So just always write 4.0 in my papers. And in fact, that's the only grade you can give me, because if you give me anything else, you trigger me. It's interesting to note that a recent survey by Legal Cheek, a British-based legal news website, appears that law students are as divided on being exposed to trigger warnings as professors and university administrators are on implementing them. The survey found that 419 respondents, which included academics, barristers, paralegals, and students, not sure what a barrister is, 59% did not support trigger warnings, while 31% did. Of the students, however, 52% prefer not to be subject to warnings, while 48% did. Now, of course, it doesn't tell us how many students of that 419 were. But even if, with all the other people that they included, that they represented 1/4 of the respondents, so only 100 students took this, 52 students said, oh, we don't want the warnings, and 48 did. It's still a rather low rate. But even then, there is a division on the issue. It also makes me question, who were these students? What classrooms were you taking this from? Because it seems pretty good that if you go to certain classrooms, you will get certain results. Again, I'd have to look up the survey, but yeah, I don't have the money for that. I only have money for a computer. Hint, hint, hee hee, ha ha. So Philip Cohen teaches sociology in the University of Maryland, added warnings to his contemporary family issues lecture after a student excused herself from the classroom, and later all discussions of abortion after Cohen presented a statistical stating that 32% of pregnancies among unmarried couples in an abortion compared to 6% among married couples. So in reading this, one student had a problem. And you know what? How many are in a classroom? 20, 30, 50, 100? Let's say 50. 1/50th of his student population. And that's not even taking into account that he might be teaching multiple classes in a single day. Let's just assume one class, 50 students. One student has a problem, therefore he must change. Not for the majority, but for the vast minority. Because one student had a problem. All right. So Cohen suggests that it would be a malpractice to exclude discussions on abortion statistic. And while he included trigger warnings in the course syllabus, he asserts that we can't function if we have to warn everybody about every traumatic topic throughout the semester. So he included it, probably pressure from the school to say, well, now you need to start doing this because one student complained. And we don't want to wind up on the 6 o'clock news that we're a rape culture here. So now you have to do this. But he's like, look, I put it in my syllabus. The students should have been aware of this. They can't be running crying from the room. And I'm not going to hold their hand. So respect for Philip, but I think he was coerced into doing this. And even not, he still makes a valid point. All right, Seda Chris, I understand you have to go to bed. I know this is a long video and there's just a lot to discuss. I might stop after this chapter and do a part 2. In fact, I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to finish up this chapter and then we'll come back for part 2. Neil Gilbert, a professor of social welfare and social services at the University of California, Berkeley, dropped a lecture on abortion from his master level social welfare policy course, citing implication of student sensitivities on administrative review of professor performance. So because he received a professor performance review and said, hey, we don't like the discussions on abortion, he said, okay, I'm going to drop it. You know, it was put on the course syllabus for a reason. There's probably something important that students need to know when going out into their future, and instead just drops it all together. So that information is something that's not going to be given to them as a result. I like reading these little things. I mean, even though that's all Chu really relies on, Ismail Muhammad, an instructor at the University of California, Berkeley, added this trigger warning. Content notice. This semester, our objects of study deal with the issues of race, class, gender, sexuality, bigotry, and violence. As a result, this class will be a space to think deeply about explicit and, in some cases, disturbing text. To his course syllabus, after he noticed the sordid expressions of the face of Asian American students following the screening of the 1974 film Chinatown. I've heard of that film, but I'm not very familiar with it. But no one complained to him. He just noticed that some people had some sour faces, so then he has to include, you know, a trigger warning that's saying, hey, this race deals with a lot of shit. And doesn't say what he actually teaches, though. So for all we know, it's probably film study. But still, I mean, the classroom is not a place to avoid trauma. It's a place to be subjected to things that we're not necessarily comfortable for hearing. That's the point. That's how we develop critical thinking, is when we hear things that we don't necessarily like and we're forced to consider them. That exercise alone is necessary for us to develop critical thinking. But if that's taken away, altogether, if people can opt out of hearing anything that disagrees with them, they don't develop critical thinking. They just work in an echo chamber. Susan Heschel, a Jewish studies professor at Dartmouth College, added warnings to her syllabus following students' complaint about upsetting content in the documentary Night and Fog, describing the liberation of a Nazi concentration camp. Really? You needed to add trigger warnings to a movie about Nazi concentration camps? Really? Wow. I need a trigger warning on the movie talking about rape. I don't think you gave one. I said it was a movie on rape. You couldn't take that there was a trigger warning from that? No. You need to provide it a trigger warning. Okay, trigger warning. This movie is about rape. This movie is called The Rape Movie. I know, stupid example, but I'm sure that the professor talked about it being a Nazi concentration camp movie, and someone couldn't take, well, you know, that might not be a film I want to watch, so maybe I should go and look it up. Oh, it has some things that I'm not going to like seeing. I'm going to tell the professor I'd be uncomfortable by this film. And then the professor says, well, either you watch it or you fail the course. That simple. It's not going to happen, but it's what should be taught. Rani Newtill, who taught a course in representation of sex in American cinema, describes on multiple occasions how students left the classroom in tears following viewings and discussions related to Melvin Van Peebles' Sweet Sweetback Badass song, which depicts statutory rape. Newtill describes how, despite issuing warnings before every scene she screened in class, a student had requested that she send emails before class outlining a list of potentially distressing scenes that would be screened, as not to single out survivors if they had to excuse themselves. So this is pertinent here, because even though she gave trigger warnings, even though she's like, hey, by the way, the scene we're about to watch depicts this content, and people had to run out of class because they were triggered by it, they don't want to be noticed for their triggering. Being triggered is itself a trigger. Listen to that. Being triggered is itself a trigger and singles themselves out as having triggers, and they don't want that. They want to be anonymous in their triggers. So they want the professor to do extra work, email them saying, hey, the film we're watching tomorrow has all of these triggers. And, you know, my problem with this is that in doing something like that, wouldn't a student's like, hey, I really want to go to this concert tomorrow, but, oh, I have this class I have to do. Oh, I'll just say that this film that has rape in it is a trigger warning for me so I can go to the concert. And it's not my intention to undermine anyone who might be traumatized by seeing depictions of rape, but it's going to be abused if you allow the system to happen. So the last example highlights a challenge for instructors wishing to utilize warnings for movies and films where any number of scenes may come off as triggering to individuals susceptible to trigger-based distress. So here are some of the things that have turned up in English literature. F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, has suicide and domestic violence, so the trigger warnings are issued accordingly. Alison Bechdel, Fun Home, a family tragedy has pornographic depictions. Wasn't it Bechdel that created the Bechdel test? Or was that a different Bechdel? Let's see. Metamorphosis by, I believe that was Kafka, has depictions of rape in it. King Lear by Shakespeare has violence against women and suicide, and The Merchant of Venice has anti-Semitism. Since when was anti-Semitism a trigger warning? I thought social justice warriors hated the Jews. Okay, so let's read these here. English literature students at Cambridge University received warnings for sexual violence in a lecture titled Control and Consequence. When do we laugh at violence and why? Cruelty and sympathy. Centered around Shakespeare's Titus, whatever, and the Comedy of Errors. Sarah Kane's Blasted and Phaedra's Love in Euphrates, blah, blah, blah. So he had to give trigger warnings about when is it okay to laugh at violence. I think the title alone indicates that there might be some triggers in there. University of Kentucky reading program attached a physical copy of trigger warnings to each copy of Picking Cotton, our memoir of injustice and redemption, which includes sexual assault and racial dynamics. Now, this is actually a book on my list of books to read. My friend, um, Godless Mom, she recommended that I read this book. Or is it Atheist Mom? I think it's Godless Mom. But she has a great website, by the way. And this is a case where a man was falsely convicted for rape. That he didn't commit rape, but he got charged with rape, and he spent like 30 years in prison before DNA evidence proved that he wasn't guilty. So it's a very powerful case, especially since he forgave the woman who basically sent him to prison for all of those years, and they worked together to try to prevent this from happening from other people. So there's trigger warnings, but it's even sweeter than that. And suggested that students may elect to only read Ronald Cotton's chapter of Picking Cotton, excerpt pages 127 to 131. So you have this big, big book, but you only have to read pages 127 to 131 just so you won't be triggered. That's what this is starting to come down to. It's like, you need to read this big whole book in order to graduate, but you only need to really read 5 pages because the rest of it might trigger you. Hell, let's go even further than that. Here's Moby Dick, and this is a violent tale. So you only have to read the first 3 words. My name is Ishmael. That's it. You're done. You graduate. Students at Duke University requested trigger warning on Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, a family tragicomedy, on the basis of moral incorruptibility, with one student reportedly saying, I'm a Christian, and the nature of Fun Home means that content that I might have consented to read in print now violates my conscience due to its pornographic nature. Now, it's interesting to note that reported examples of trigger warnings have been limited mainly to humanities, gender studies, English language, literature, history, film studies, and law, but have yet to be commonplace in sciences, biology, chemistry, computer science, engineering, and math and physics. Okay, it looks like I'm broadcasting again. I do apologize for that interruption. Wow, my hair's a mess. So I'm going to go ahead and end this. We're about to the end anyways. The last thing that Mr. Chu talks about is how there's a difference between humanities and sciences, that trigger warnings have yet to be commonplace in science. And it's like, well, why do you think that is? And he doesn't really explore what the difference is between humanities and sciences. But he's just saying that, well, we see it a lot in sciences, but we see it a lot in humanities, but not sciences. And this is a real problem because, because these are male dominated subjects and men don't allow for trigger warnings to happen. No. Women in biology are scared and scared in chemistry. Oh, we're so scared to learn about, ice melting because a girl was raped by a snowman, and the snowman was made of ice. So when you talk about ice, that triggers me. Yeah, let's go with that. I mean, biology, chemistry, computer science, engineering, math, physics, these talk about the nature of the universe itself, or rather abstract concepts that really don't intersect with what it means to be human. I mean, they affect the humans' lives, but they don't explore what it means to be human in order to do these things. They rather describe processes. Whereas humanities, like gender studies, English literature, history, film studies, and law, these, well, with the exception of law, the first ones describe I'm sorry, this is going in and out on me. I do apologize for that. I think something is just going screwy with my internet connection. I don't even know how this is going to turn out. So I'm going to go ahead and end it here. Go ahead and look at my stuff down below. As I said earlier in the video, I'm trying to save up now for a modern computer so I can do better videos on YouTube. I can start teaching online. If I have that, I can be in a position to actually help myself. Ideally, I would like $5,000 because that would buy everything I needed, not just a computer, but like a monitor, speakers, mouse, keyboard. Computer would be the most expensive, but that would also set me up for a few years, so I wouldn't have to worry about that cost. I don't think it would really cost me $5,000, but it is a number that I'm aiming at. And then I could also get myself some health insurance to actually help my condition. Maybe. I don't think there's anything that really can help my condition, but I want some actual insurance so I can find a doctor who's willing to help me. So, because a lot of the specialists I've spoken to, I call the doctor's offices, like, yeah, we don't accept Medicaid, so we don't accept access, which is what the Arizona system is. So, please help me out with that. Donate down below. There's also my PayPal. There's also my book if you don't want to do Patreon. So that's going to do it for me today. We're going to probably have a couple of different parts for this. I again apologize for the video. I don't know how this is going to come about, if it's going to do it all as one video or several different videos. But anywho, that's going to do it for me today. This is Mad Cat signing off.